Look, I love the movie and I'm glad it's nominated. It deserves every award it gets, but come on now. We need a sequel or a TV show just about Ruby's parents and only about Ruby's parents. Howdy, I'm Jeff Goldsmith, and this is the Q&A. My agenda is simple. Each week, I plan to bring you in-depth insight into the creative process of storytelling. Folks, I am quite pleased to have with me today writer-director Siân Heder to talk about her Oscar and WGA-nominated film, Coda. You know, this is a great film. If you haven't yet seen it, you are sleeping, my friends, but I kind of think you probably have seen it by now. It's on Apple Plus, and one of the things that I did recently that makes this Q&A was we did a virtual screening for Coda. That's right, this Q&A played after hundreds of people all over the US and world, actually. We took off geo-blocking. Were able to watch Coda from the comfort of their own home and then see the Q&A between Siân and I. And all of our Q&As that we do on Zoom go straight into the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, so you could watch them there as well if you'd like to watch us chat. And if you're not on our list to get these invites for virtual screenings and for in-person screenings in Los Angeles when they start up again, you could just go to backstory.net/events and sign up. It's totally free. And you'll get emails from us from time to time, especially when we do these virtual events, which we'd love to have you at, as they are free. And look, without a doubt, Coda is such a fantastic film, and Siân had so many great insights in what it took to write it and direct it so that it became this WGA and Oscar nominated flick. I know you'll dig this episode. And speaking of things to dig, I hope you check out Backstory Magazine over at backstory.net. We recently released our winter issue, our Dune issue number 45. And we've put excerpts up on our website that you could read for free. There's a lot of great stuff in there, and you could check out the table of contents to see what's inside. If you've never read us before, you could check out our free issue over at backstory.net. or via our iPad app, Backstory. And I hope you do, because if you want to become a subscriber, we're now working on our awards issue, which will be out in a bit. And use coupon code SAVE5, and it'll give you access to all the Backstory content that we produce. SAVE5, you could use that over at our website, and it will save you $5 off a 1-year subscription. So look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and iTunes and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page support my passion project. So thanks for considering. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right into our chat with writer-director Siân Heder to talk about her latest film, Coda. Siân, it's awesome to have you today. How's it going?
It's a little hectic today, but I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, I love this film. I first saw it at Sundance on my couch, because that's the way it was at Sundance 2021.
Me too. That's how I watched it too.
But honestly, your film is so great that myself and my editor Danny Monso for Backstory Magazine, we called each other the minute we were done watching it, and I'm like, I think this could get nominated. And he's like, it's their slot to lose. I mean, we both agreed. It's so great. It's such a great story. So I'm so glad to have you.
People kept saying that to me, and it almost felt like something your mom would say, or like your crazy neighbor that doesn't understand Hollywood, where you're like, okay, like you don't really get how the business works, and this is a little indie movie, and it doesn't really happen that way. And so I was stunned, honestly. I mean, even though I sort of felt the momentum towards that, it really still stunned me.
Come on, Coda's the underdog, and we're rooting for Ruby. I
am down to be the underdog, man. I mean, we had very, very few resources making this movie, and it was really scrappy and a struggle. And so it's amazing to watch it take this ride.
Well, so we are going to get into all that. So I'm going to ask you just one or two lightning flash questions before we get into Coda, because I love giving people a baseline as to who you are and from whence dost thou hail. Did you go to film school?
So I grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which was about 50 minutes away from Gloucester, Massachusetts, which is where the film takes place. And I went to Gloucester every summer of my life. So it was a very personal place for me. So there's that. I grew up in a family of artists. I started out as an actor, and I went to Carnegie Mellon Conservatory program as an actor, and then moved to New York and, did off Broadway and did Law and Order and the things that actors do in New York. And
right.
Then, but was always a writer. It was always something that was my personal, outlet for, a lot of kind of my inner life. And then came out to LA, was working as an actor and but also kind of involved in with a lot of filmmakers and going to these reading nights where I'd be reading their stuff and we would be sort of doing an exchange, and started bringing in my writing to this group called Tuesdays at 9, which would happen at St. Nick's Pub, and got very excited about writing and having that truly maybe as a path forward instead of just my own private creative outlet. And then applied to AFI with a short film script called Mother, which I made through the AFI Directing Workshop for Women. So made that film. That film went to Cannes. So it was my first short that went to Cannes and was in competition at Cannes and won an award at Cannes. And so suddenly it was like, wait, what's happening? Oh, I guess I'm doing this. And I wrote a feature based on that short. And it took me 9 years to get that feature made. And that was Tallulah.
And also, you had some TV writing experiences too, of men of a certain age. So you kind of were really honing your craft as a writer. And I'm glad you pointed it out, because it isn't said often enough. Your beginnings as an actor, I think, really gave you that footing as a director to be able to know how to talk to actors properly and just evoke the fantastic performances that you did here. And so just briefly, because I know we could do a whole episode about it, but Tallulah is your first film. So it's your first trial by fire. What, if anything, could you boil down to be your biggest lesson on Tallulah that maybe changed your creative habits moving forward for something like Coda?
I think, Tallulah, I was working with very established actors. I was working with Allison Janney and Elliot Page, and they're both very experienced. And I agree. I mean, I did start out as an actor, and I have a common language with actors. I really understand what that is to be on the other side of that equation. And I understand how vulnerable it is. And I have, I would say when I started directing, that was the one thing I had absolute confidence in, is my ability to talk with actors and guide performance and understand that relationship and how intimate and connected it needs to be. So, and for me, the process as a filmmaker was really learning the camera, learning the lenses, learning what a 40 does, learning what sort of understanding that component, understanding how to block a scene and shot design and what, so yes, again, like my background, I think, but then led me to feeling very comfortable with performance. With Tallulah, Tallulah was a super scrappy production. We had 22 days to shoot that film, and it was incredibly ambitious. And we were in New York City, and we were working with babies. We had supposedly one baby in the film played by 8 babies. So, and I was 7 months pregnant at the time, and I had a 16-month-old. So I was
is what you're saying.
I was covered in babies for the making of Tallulah. So everything seemed easy after that. It was almost like the hardest a film could be. So then it was interesting on Coda, like any of the challenges that arose, it almost felt like, so we're on fishing boats. That's fine. We're working with interpreters and we're on fishing boats and we're trying to record music live. And I think the lesson I learned from Tallulah, and also the lesson I learned, because you're right, I did start writing for TV. And in the time that I was trying to get Tallulah made, I wrote on Men of a Certain Age and then Orange is the New Black for 3 seasons. Yeah. And was producing all of my episodes. So I was shadowing directors essentially as well, and really understanding how to make your days, how to, flip a location on the fly. And when you need to rewrite for some, reimagine something somewhere else. So I think that problem solving part of your brain and kind of the understanding that things can change and it's okay. And you have to have sort of a very strong sense of the story that you're telling coming in, so that when everything does change, what's essential.
That's great advice.
So, my DP and I, Paula, who I've worked with a lot, she shot my first short film, and she shot Tallulah. She also shot Coda. She shot my show, Little America, that I co-show run. One of the things we do when we're shot listing and we're kind of designing kind of the feel and look of the movie is, for every scene, I have a shot in mind that I know sums up the scene for me visually. And it's kind of when I have that shot for every scene, or maybe it's more than one, but if everything went to shit and I had to throw it all out and I could only get a couple things, I would know which thing to keep because that somehow represents the heart of the scene or the heart of the story.
Well,
So,
and that's what's so great about really having a good locked script before you go into production. Of course, we could both name great movies that don't, but if you do, it means that you know the essence of your scene, so that when production quirks occur, you could, as you said, get them another way, which is really fantastic.
and it really does. I mean, there was a scene with Elliot Page it was probably the key scene in Tallulah, which is when Tallulah is running away. And basically I knew this was a character who never stopped running, who would always, that was her exit strategy, was to get out of a situation and flee. And this was a moment where I needed a different choice to be made. And on the day, we lost the subway. Were basically everything was pulled. I mean, the subway cops like kicked us out of the train and we had to steal it. And my DP and I Paula and I ran down on the other side and, we had no sound recording. It was like we had one shot to get this thing, but what the scene's about in your heart. You have it in your bones. So I could talk to Paula quickly and go like, it's this and this and this and this. And yes, we're shooting on a live train and people are going to be getting off and it's going to be chaotic. But if you can get this feeling from that, and it's actually one of my favorite scenes in that.
I was going to say, like, I'm surprised it had that much stress going into it because it's a great scene. It's a great scene.
But it is that it's the work you do ahead of time to be inside of your story so completely that you can be fluid on set and you can be adaptable and creative in the moment. And that was so helpful on Coda because things were always changing. And it's always
before we get into the production of Coda, sorry to interrupt. I want to give people a baseline on your creative habits. So before we get there, though, I have to ask the most boring question ever that you've been asked 30 million times. So you could rush through it if you want. How did you first come across the 2014 French film La Familia Belier? And I'm sure I pronounced it wrong.
Yeah, it's okay. I do. Belier.
Thank you.
It's kind of a boring story in the sense that it's a boring story that became a non-boring story, which is that I was at Sundance with Tallulah and I had gotten back and was kind of looking for what my next movie was and wasn't sure, and kind of didn't have a strong sense of that. I feel like I'm always looking at telling stories of dysfunctional family in some way. I'm always looking at characters making hard decisions and very, I'm always telling stories about marginalized people in some way or outsiders trying to kind of make their way. And so it was sent to me by Lionsgate at the time. And the producers, so it was the French producers who had the movie at Lionsgate and Philippe Rousselet and Patrick Watchberger. And it was sent to me, as would you consider this film? And at first I felt like, I don't want to do a remake. And also I'd been sent so many teenage girl stories that it felt like, why do I have to tell a high school girl story? But when I watched the film, I was so moved that I had never seen a deaf family on screen before like that. I had never seen a deaf family sitting around a dinner table. And yet there were certain missed opportunities in that film that also felt like they needed to be righted. There were hearing actors playing deaf roles. I think the ASL was limited for that reason because you couldn't have a full expression of the language because you didn't have native speakers on screen. And I was very moved by the story. And yet I also saw so much potential in where I could take it and deepen it and get into this character and what the dilemma of being a Coda actually is, and that sense of responsibility to your family. And yet, the desire to really be your own person and the navigating of these two different worlds, the deaf world and the hearing world. And so there was just so much to dig into and also to make personal because there was a lot of freedom. It was like, well, we want to tell this story. We don't know who these people are. They could be anything. And again, I'd grown up going to Gloucester, Massachusetts every summer of my life. I was really well aware of the struggles in the fishing community there and what an interesting town that was, and the conflicts that were happening there and the contradictions within the town. So when I hit on that and was like, oh, these people could be this, hard scrabble fishing family in Gloucester, it really came alive for me. And I felt like I could put myself into the story.
That's awesome. When you sit down to write, I want to talk about your creative habit. How important is outlining to your process? Obviously, this is technically an adaptation because you're going, to an extent from another film as just a blueprint, but you still completely made it your own. But how important is outlining to your process in general? I know from your TV past, TV stresses outline very heavily, but is it as important for you in features?
TV really did teach me the outlining journey. I think when I first started writing, because I was an actor, I almost probably wrote dialogue first. It was like I would have an idea for an interesting exchange between characters and I would kind of write that scene. And then I'd be like, oh, this could be another cool scene. And how would I get there from here? And sort of looking at the map. And so it was very fluid. And I think the process was really organic and flowy. And I don't need to know where I'm going. I'm just going to find my way there. And there's something that I love about that, because oftentimes a character can just do something and you surprise yourself with that thing that they do. Oh my God, she's taking the baby. I didn't expect her to take the baby. Right. And it's sort of like, you almost feel like you're channeling these people and then they're acting on their own. So there's something I love about that. And yet, it involves so much rewriting and shaping if you start that way, because you kind of start that way and then you go like, oh, well, I really do need a second act shift and I really do need a climax and all of that. And so, when I was writing for TV, both on Men of a Certain Age and Orange, you have to deliver outlines and you have to have a really clear sense of where you're going, even if it all changes when you write it.
Right.
So my approach to outlining now is very much like give myself a map, know where I'm going, and then also give myself permission to throw out that map as I'm writing, as it doesn't work for me. But it is helpful to have the map so that you can even contradict it. You're like, oh, well, I thought this character should do this here. And guess what? They're not going to do that, but I still want that ending. So I still got to find my way there. So I definitely do. I do outline now, on the features that I'm writing. I have very detailed outlines before I start, but often they're also a little bit of like an in-between, because I feel like if I'm outlining and I get an idea for a scene, I'll just write the scene. Like I don't want to be stuck in the outline or not. So a lot of my documents are kind of in between. It's like
that's cool. Like a hybrid, like partially bullet points, partially just dialogue.
And I write outlines in final drafts so that if I feel like writing a scene, the scene comes out and then the scene is just there in the outline, and that's something to use or not use as I move forward. But
so you have a final draft document just open, basically?
Yeah.
Like the script document, or do you use the word processing part of it?
Usually if I start outlining, I usually start with cards, or I start on my whiteboard and I'll get it all up there and kind of get the scenes up there. And then the next step for me is usually I'll start in a Word document and kind of get like a beat sheet almost. And then I'll move into final draft and outline in final draft as though it was a script, but I'm not writing any dialogue. I'm just writing the outline in that, because I find that that's an easier next step once you start writing, to just take your outline and expand it, as opposed to having a whole other journey to make another document.
This is the nerdiest thing, but have you ever used Beatbox in final draft, in which it like lets you have your own cards, but you could also do like little scenes, and it's just this other part of it. Have you ever used that?
I haven't, because I love getting away from my computer. So anything that involves me like handwriting on index cards and taping them to my wall, or gets me out of my chair and gets me standing at the whiteboard writing, like I love it. And it is super helpful for me to not always be at my computer and be putting things in a physical space that I can relate to visually.
Again, geeky, do you have a limit of cards that you like? So some people say to them, and I'm making this up, like first act equals generally 12 cards, or, they have like their little routine of
absolutely not.
Okay.
That sounds way more organized than my brain could ever be.
Okay. Well, so actually to go to that effect, you just have like cards that you separate into little piles of act 1, act 2, act 3. Do you do it like that?
Well, I put them up on the wall. So I'll have like an act 1 section. And section, act 3 section. Yeah.
Okay, cool. When you sit down to write, is it more important for you to give yourself a certain amount of hours each day, or do you like to give yourself a page count to hit each day?
I don't do either.
There's no one way to do it. I love it. I love it. So
I don't do either. I mean, I think I see what comes out. I usually now, especially, I'm so busy that I have like this chunk of time to work, and I'm okay with whatever comes out in that time. Maybe to a fault, because I think sometimes with deadlines, that's hard. But, I was on this panel yesterday with all of my heroes. It was like, Denis Villeneuve and Guillermo del Toro and Tony Kushner, which I just couldn't even believe. But Tony Kushner said something amazing where he was talking about writing, and he said that he thinks that not writing is as important as writing.
Sure.
And that imagination has its own timeline, and you also have to honor that timeline. And a lot of times the idea of putting these intense deadlines that you have on the process of being imaginative feels a little counterintuitive. And yet also that can be an incredible procrastination excuse. And
yes, of course.
Way to not get it done.
But hey, listen to Kushner. Always listen to Kushner. That's
right. Tony Kushner said it. So I'm like, I'll take it. I'll take that.
You have permission, my friend.
Goal. Yeah.
Obviously, raising a budget is never easy. How long did it take you to complete your script? And then how long did it take you to get your budget going?
Well, I wrote the script in about, I don't know. It was like writing and then rewriting and adapted. So I don't know. It was like a year probably of of kind of like doing the draft and then, getting notes and doing rewrites, but it was being developed at a studio. So there was also this kind of pressure from the studio of how are we going to make this? You have 3 deaf actors in the lead, and I was insisting on a deaf cast, and Marley Matlin is the only famous deaf person who, is, not the only, but I'm saying in the terms of like a studio thinking about financeable actors. And then I had this 17-year-old girl in the lead who was, needed to sing and sign and be every scene in the movie. And so that to me felt like it needed to be a discovery. And then I had this so the studio model of how they traditionally think about financing a movie was hard in this case. And so there was a lot of time spent trying to figure out the puzzle that would make sense to their financial model. And they finally sort of weren't going to make it. And I realized that I wasn't willing to make the compromises that I probably would need to make to get it made at the studio. But that was okay with me because I knew that there was a way this project should exist. And I'd rather see it die than to see it get made the wrong way. And then there was it sat for a long time. I think it was probably 6 months or something where it just kind of sat there and we thought it was dead. And I mourned the project. And because I thought the studio owned it and there wasn't a way to get it out. And then Patrick Washburger left Lionsgate and he took it with him as part of his exit package. Like we sort of paid to extricate it from the studio, but he had that leverage because he could sort of make it part of his deal to get it out. And that was joyful because then it felt like it was ours and we could go figure out how to make it independently for a lot less money. And they did. Patrick and Philippe got together and we financed it through Vendome and Pathé and made it fully independently.
What was the budget and schedule, the final budget and schedule?
The schedule was 30 days.
Okay, great.
And I don't know. I feel like I can.
Okay, that's fine. You don't have to say the budget if you don't want. Ooh, hey, I'm jumping in really quick to remind you to check out Backstory Magazine over at backstory.net. You could read us on a desktop or laptop or via our iPad app, Backstory. And we just recently published our Dune issue, our winter issue, and there's a lot to read in there. You could see it all in our table of contents. And even after we publish, we add new articles, like, for instance, this absolutely huge Star Wars anime article for Star Wars Visions on Disney Plus. Just to give you a tease on it, because it is a 5,000-word article, we put excerpts up for free for you to read on our website, backstory.net. So you could see stuff there. If you've never read us before, you could check out the free issue on the iPad app Backstory or at backstory.net. And if you like what you read, I hope you'll consider becoming a subscriber. And if you want to become a subscriber, please use discount coupon code SAVE5. That'll save you $5 off a 1-year subscription to Backstory Magazine. You could use the code in the shopping cart on our website, and it'll still give you access to the iPad version as well. So you'll have both. And look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners in iTunes and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page support my passion project. So thanks for considering. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right back into our conversation with writer-director Siân Heder about her WGA and Oscar-nominated film, Coda. I know we're starting to run out of time, so I definitely want to get into spoilers really quick. People at the virtual screening, you've just seen the movie, so you don't need a spoiler alert. Podcast listeners and iTunes and Spotify and YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, we are getting straight into the spoilers right now. So if you have not yet seen Coda, please press pause, go to Apple Plus TV, watch Coda, come back, finish the conversation. All right, we're in the spoilers. So right from the beginning, you disarm us.
Just a note about spoilers. I think this is funny on this movie because I don't know that this is a movie that can be spoiled by spoilers.
You know, you're right. But I mean,
like in a way, like I feel like you sort of know where the movie's going from the moment that you start as an audience anyway. And that was part of it for me, was like, it's the ride there, not necessarily the kind of, you know, there's no Kaiser Soze is what I'm saying.
There is no Kaiser Soze, but right at the beginning, you disarm the audience to let them know what kind of movie it's going to be. You have her translating for her parents at a doctor's visit where they have jock itch and are told that they can't have sex for 2 weeks, and that upsets them greatly. And it's just like, it's not your first scene, but it's really a deeper introduction into the family dynamic and who these people are. And it was just such a great way in. Tell us about planting that scene that early, because you know, it's unexpected. You know, it's what separates it from something that has a little bit of an edge and is able to surprise us from, you know, a TV movie.
I think what was so important to me was to let the audience know that they could laugh. There is a lot of fear around disability. People get weird. They feel like can I laugh? I don't know. Is this serious? Am I supposed to be educated right now? Am I supposed to be learning something? And part of the joy of this film for me was that flipping some of those tropes that have existed about characters that have disabilities, and this idea that so often people who have a disability in film are either so noble that they're kind of earnest and untouchable, or they're objects of pity, and the audience is supposed to feel sorry for this person. And I wasn't interested in that. Like, this was a normal, crazy, messy family who was funny and outrageous and had an incredibly dirty sense of humor. And I wanted to make sure early on that I was messaging to my audience, like, this isn't precious. Like, these are people, you're a person, everybody, we can all laugh together. So it was important to me to have those scenes really early, you know, to make sure that going into the film, that you're right, it didn't feel overly emotional or too precious. And the story is a very emotional story, and it's a very sweet story. So it was almost like, how do I counteract that sweetness with just some dirtiness and to let people know, like, no, this has some edge, and I don't want this to feel like a film you've seen before. And it's important to me that these characters are lived in, real screwed up people the way that we all
are. And you know, what's interesting is, you're right, there's no Kaiser Soze, but you know what is the spoiler of this movie? It's your creativity. It's the creative approach that you took to material that has been presented in other ways before, right? So we've seen my son is a comic book artist and I'm the sports dad and I don't understand. And then finally he sees the comic. They can't do that. So I think your triumph here was when they finally go to the performance at school, which is, you know, the big scene that we've seen before in these movies, the culmination of all the practice that we've seen between her and Miles, right? Her duet partner. And right as they're getting ready to sing, you go from the perspective of the family, which is they just can't experience what her talent is. And the only thing they could do is look around, which is what her dad does. Look around to see how everyone else is interpreting it. And you kill the sound, which was also bold and brilliant, because you don't give us the big payoff that we were expecting between these two at that particular moment. Talk about the arc of getting to that creative decision for that scene, but then the very beautiful scene that follows a little bit later when her dad asks her to sing for him and he puts his hand on her throat so he could feel the emotion and the passion to an extent as best as he can. But it's a great setup of parents not understanding their child's dream, because not because they're being, you know, bad parents, but because there's a a physical limitation of how much they could interpret it.
Well, there's so much in what you just said. I mean, yes, there were classic elements to this story that we've seen hundreds of times before, including The Big Show, right? Like you watch Absolutely. A movie where a character is practicing and practicing and practicing, and you've watched her rehearse this song. I think you hear it 5 times in the movie. So you've watched it 4 times and you're waiting for this moment. So the audience is craving hearing her sing at that moment. And we are also used to that moment in a movie, right? Where you get that payoff and the satisfaction of, oh, now we get to see this thing we've been waiting for. So it was the perfect place to do it, because in the moment that the audience wants it the most, you take it away from the audience and you really put a hearing audience in the deaf perspective. And what I loved about where it occurred in the movie is that I don't know that it would have an impact early on, because you're not emotionally connected to these people. I think you have to fall in love with these characters and you have to invest in them and feel like you know them, and then realize that you don't, right? When the sound is taken away, suddenly it's not about knowing them. It's knowing what it's like to be them. And that is a very different thing. And movies are the most incredible tool that we have for building empathy. Like, you take this emotional journey with a character, and if you feel what they feel, then you leave that experience with a certain openness and understanding to what is that day-to-day experience like. So the placement of it was really important to me. There's also something that you said about parents and children. And that was a really important part of this story, I think, and something I talked a lot about with Marley and with Troy. And, and I'm a parent. Like, I was a teenage girl and now I'm a mother. And so there's kind of this thing in parenting that I've realized where there's a connectedness to your kid where it's hard to disconnect and realize they are wholly another being that have nothing to do with you.
Right.
And there's so much projection that goes on, and it's so hard to separate yourself and go, you see behaviors and you're like, my daughter's really emotional. That's what I was like. And so she's like me. And instead of kind of recognizing like that this is a person out in the world on their own journey, and that she's not a part of me. She's her own being. So what I love about that scene that on the truck is, you're right. Like Frank will never understand what music is in the way that Ruby understands what music is. And it doesn't matter. Like, what matters as a parent is loving your child, supporting your child, making an effort, extending that you care and you're trying. And that is what kids feel. And that's what empowers kids to go out and do their thing. So my favorite part of that scene is at the end where Ruby looks at him kind of like, did you get it? Did you get anything? And Troy in that moment just made this like little kind of smile, and he made this little face that was kind of like, not really, but it didn't matter. It's like they had made this team effort, he in trying to understand her and trying to give it to him. And so it was about connection and intimacy and a parent child, trying to reach across that divide. And that was the important thing, not that there was some transference that happened. That was kind of the journey of the scene. And it was powerful. And I think it was powerful even in that it was fulfilling and yet also unfulfilling. It's
a fantastic scene. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the other great scene that you wrote with her parents, which is her and her mom. And her mom saying that she was praying for a deaf child. And she was scared of how she would possibly disappoint a hearing child. It was a great dynamic to set that up. And I commend you again on that scene as well. But I know we're running out of time. I got to ask, what was your toughest scene going through this? What was the scene as a writer and as a director that you kept coming back to again and again? And how did you creatively conquer that scene?
The thing that I think, interestingly, the family always felt pretty clear to me, just because I could see each person's perspective so clearly. I could see Leo. I could see how, being the older brother, you would just be full of rage that your sister, your little sister has been empowered in this way in your family just because she can hear and you can. And it's, and that he is perfectly capable in the world and is seeing this codependent relationship happen between his parents and his sister and is hugely aggravated by that. I could see Frank's perspective of losing your livelihood and trying desperately to kind of provide for your family. I could see Jackie's perspective of sort of being so wrapped up in her own reality and her own experience with her own mother that she's projecting that onto her relationship with her kid. Right. Weirdly, like, I think the teacher took a journey for me, how
Mr. V is the best.
Yeah, he's great, but also like really trying to capture who he was to Ruby and the way he's able to unlock her and the way. So I think, like, writing wise, in a way, I think that was an interesting place that I had to dig into and really discover what are those steps between the two of them and also creating actual physical, because I think so oftentimes in film, like, the conflict's not real. Like, the conflict's not real. You know what I mean? And I was like, I need real physical things pulling on her. I need her family's business to go to hell exactly at the moment that she gets into college and actually go to hell. So it requires her to stay there. So it was also creating, like, how do you build real stakes in a story that doesn't have a villain and doesn't have kind of the normal drama machinations going on.
Right. What you're talking about is the situation, because of course she does not go to Mr. B's house for her after school training because she has to be responsible to her family for the news interview to be their translator, which was perfectly placed. So that was just great to show a huge obstacle. What was your biggest challenge for a scene as a director, if one scene leaps out?
Look, everything on the boat was so hard because we were out at sea and we were shooting on a real boat 3 miles out at sea in 5-foot waves and, really with a limited crew because we could only put 10 people on that boat. And, but it was so fun. It was also this really scrappy, like, it felt completely guerrilla and like, I didn't have any art department on the boat and I was the only person who could. So I was shoveling the fish with my hands from, bucket to bucket. And it was just really, really wild. The concert was really hard. The concert was really challenging because we covered it to have as much freedom as possible in the edit. And really covered everything that was happening on stage in a very traditional way, covered everything that was happening in the audience, covered the deaf perspective, and then really wanted to give ourselves freedom in the edit. And so it was probably the scene that I cut, I cut it the most. It was the first thing we were working on when we went in. It was the last thing we were working on before we locked picture. It went through so many evolutions to get where it ended up. And also, we cut over 30 scenes from the movie.
Wow.
In the edit, which I've never done before. But so it was this whittling process that was very, very intense to kind of
subplot of the fishing village or something else. I know we're out of time.
Oh my God, so many. I mean, there was Leo and Gertie had an entire love story arc that went on. Mr. V, you met his family, you found out where he came from, you heard his whole story. The fishing, you're right. There was a whole complicated,
How many minutes would you say those 30 scenes equaled?
I mean, our first cut was so long. Our first cut was like 3 hours long. So we were joking. We called it the Deaf Irishman because it was just, it was a very long movie. And we had to whittle and whittle and whittle and whittle. And as we were saying that this is kind of full circle, as we were saying at the beginning of this conversation, when you know what your story is about, it's very clear what should go. In the way that, when you're, like I said, if you know the one shot you need from the scene, you could throw everything else out and just make sure you got that one shot. I knew that this was a story about family. And I knew it was a story about this girl trying to pull apart and from her family and that entanglement. So anything that fed that story stayed, and anything that felt like it distracted from that story or led you out or kind of was a dogleg on the way to that, I was brutal about it.
That makes sense. I mean, and that's great to cut stuff like that, because I'm sure the Leo relationship was tough to cut, and the fishing village stuff and Mr. V. I mean, but that's great that you had that focus of only what's affecting her.
I've never cut so many good scenes from a movie. I mean, that was the shocking thing, is that I it's easy to cut bad scenes. It's easy to go in and go like, well, this doesn't work, or that performance sucked, or I cut my darling. Like I cut scenes that I was like, this is a gem. There was a scene that was so funny between Leo and Gertie where it's a sex scene, but he's also teaching her just the dirtiest sign for every sexual position that they go into. And it was like one of the things that just delighted me when I wrote it and delighted us all when we shot it. And then it just, I had to cut it. It just didn't.
I hope those are released one day on a Blu-ray or something like that, because those sound amazing. But look, we're out of time. You've been so generous with your time. Congrats on your WGA and Oscar nominations. They're well deserved, and all your other nominations. And thanks again for talking to us today, Siân.
This was really fun. Thank you for having me.
And that's how the Q&A went down. Special thanks again to writer-director Siân Heder for being so generous with her time and coming down to chat about her WGA and Oscar-nominated film, Coda. And remember, folks, this was done for a virtual event. So if you want to join us for one of our virtual free events, you could sign up to get invites at backstory.net/events. And speaking of Backstory, we recently published our winter issue, our Dune issue. There's a ton of stuff to read in there. You could see it all in our table of contents, and you could read us on a desktop or laptop or via our iPad app, Backstory. Of course, if you've never read us before, you could read our free issue. And if you like what you see, you could then use discount coupon code SAVE5, and that'll save you $5 off a 1-year subscription to Backstory Magazine. And look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and iTunes and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page support my passion project. So thanks for considering becoming a subscriber. The Q&A with Jeff Goldsmith podcast is a copyright of Unlikely Films Incorporated in 2022. All rights reserved. Folks, if you want to reach out to me on social media, you could find me as Yo Goldsmith on Twitter or Backstory_mag on Twitter. Those same two handles work on Instagram, Yo Goldsmith on Instagram or Backstory_mag on Instagram. I also have a Facebook fan page that I don't check as often, but I'm there sometimes. And you could also send me a letter anytime to backstoryletters@gmail.com. The inbox gets a little full, but I like to go through it because I love hearing from you, and I will respond, I promise. I'm Jeff Goldsmith, the publisher of Backstory Magazine and the host of the Q&A, thanking you for tuning in and telling you to stay out of trouble. Till next week.